By midday, the street had disappeared. Even that morning, residents of River Falls could still see houses, smoking chimneys, fences, and a track leading to the mill from their windows. The snow lay flat, the wind was light, and the sky seemed low and calm. By 11 o'clock, the northern horizon had darkened. A few minutes later, a sound like the distant rumble of a waterfall emanated from there. Then the wind lashed the village so hard that the shutters slammed shut, and the snow rose from the ground in a solid wall. 10 minutes later, people could no longer see the houses across the street. 20 minutes later, their own gates. By 1 o'clock, the street between the church and the shop no longer existed, only a white, roaring void where a person could pass by their own porch and not recognize it. Snowdrifts piled up on the sides, pressed against the walls, and buried the doors. Those who tried to reach the barns found their way back by touch, if they returned at all. It was then that the village headman, Edward Crane, remembered the tunnel. The day before, he had ordered its entrances filled with earth. By dawn, 6 men with shovels were to arrive, dismantle the wooden doors, and dump the frozen earth inside. Crane called the passage a dangerous hole and a disgrace to the village. Almost everyone agreed with him. Only now, when a blizzard had cut off one half of River Falls from the other, when children remained in the schoolhouse and the fire in the house of Widow Ellen Price began to fade, did the village headman realize the only road between the houses didn't run over the snow, it ran under it. The tunnel began beneath the house of a man known in the village as the Mole. His real name was Eli Voss. He lived on the northern edge, in a low log cabin near a ravine, where the winter wind whistled as if someone were sharpening a knife underground. Eli rarely visited the store, didn't attend Sunday meetings, and spoke only when words were necessary. The villagers decided he was either arrogant or crazy. When he began digging the earth between the houses, they had no doubt. Eli came to River Falls in the fall of 1879. He arrived alone in a wagon pulled by a skinny bay mare. The wagon contained shovels, a pick, coils of rope, carpenter's tools, and 2 wooden boxes. One was filled with books, blueprints, and maps. No one knew what was in the other. Eli bought a plot of land abandoned by 3 families. The land was low, rocky, and unsuitable for crops. In the spring, the stream overflowed its banks. In the fall, the ravine turned into a muddy ditch, and in the winter, the north wind blew straight into the walls. Doyle Mercer, the store owner, sold the plot for next to nothing, and later boasted that he had gotten rid of the useless land and received real money for it. Eli didn't argue. He surveyed the slope, measured the distance to the neighboring houses, drove a few stakes into the ground, and began building a cabin as if he were interested not in the surface of the lot, but in what lay beneath it. He survived his first winter without incident. The second spring, residents noticed a deep hole near his house. At first, they thought the hermit was digging a cellar, but the hole didn't widen. It led into the slope as a narrow passage, high enough for a grown man to walk with his head slightly bent. Eli reinforced the ceiling with pine beams, covered the walls with boards, and scattered the excavated earth into the ravine. By midsummer, the passage had stretched nearly 30 paces. The first to peer inside was the blacksmith's son, 12-year-old Thomas Bale. He snuck in without permission, taking a candle, and returned pale. He described the tunnel as extending into darkness, with niches carved into the sides. One contained barrels of water. The other held blankets, lamps, and bundles of dry firewood. Ropes hung from the walls, and the floor was paved with stone. "He's preparing for war," said blacksmith Harold Bale. "With whom? With the moles?" Mercer replied, and the men laughed. The next day, a nickname emerged. At first, only Eli was called Mole. Then his house became known as the Mole Hole, and the tunnel, the Madman's Passage. Children threw stones at the entrance and asked if he'd found gold. Women walked past, quickening their pace. Some claimed he was hiding stolen goods. Others said he wanted to break into other people's basements. Eli didn't answer. He was setting up another support, checking the water flow after the rain, and continuing south. Only once was he asked directly why he was doing it. It happened in the store, when Elder Crane, a tall man with a habit of speaking as if his every word was already written into law, stopped Eli at the counter. "People have a right to know what you're digging under their land," he said. "Your tunnel could collapse, flood property, or kill a child." Eli placed a bag of salt on the counter and looked at the village headman. "I don't dig under someone else's land without permission." Crane narrowed his eyes and asked if he intended to continue. Eli replied that he did. "Until when?" the village headman asked. "Until the houses are connected," Eli said calmly. The shop grew quiet. Even Mercer stopped counting coins. Crane smiled slowly, as if he'd heard the confession he'd been waiting for. "Connected for what?" he asked. Eli didn't answer right away. The first sleet was falling outside, though real winter was still more than a month away. He looked at the white flakes clinging to the glass and said, "So that one day people won't have to go outside." Laughter began near the stove and quickly spread to the shop. Someone said that Mole would soon suggest the villagers live underground. Another asked if he was planning to tunnel to the cemetery. Headman Crane didn't laugh. He looked at Eli with the cold irritation of a man whose authority had been refused. A week later, Crane called a meeting. He declared the tunnel a menace, a disgrace to the village, and should be closed. The majority voted to give Eli until the end of winter and then force him to fill the tunnel. But none of them yet knew what this winter would be like, and no one knew why Eli Voss, upon hearing the decision, didn't argue. He simply returned home, lit a lamp, descended underground, and spent the entire night strengthening the tunnel, as if counting down not the months, but the final days, until something he could already see on the horizon. Eli Voss didn't see the approaching winter in the clouds, or hear it in the cries of birds. He recognized it on the ground. In early November, the water in the shallow ditches froze overnight, though the air remained relatively warm. Within a few days, mice began leaving the fields and seeking shelter under houses. Crows gathered near the barnyards in large black flocks, and the north wind, which usually shifted direction in the evening, now blew steadily and heavily, as if a huge door had opened behind the distant hills. The rest of River Falls didn't pay any attention to this. The harvest had been good, the barns were full, and they had stored more firewood than usual. After 2 mild winters, people had learned to dismiss the elders' stories as exaggerations. They strengthened their fences, patched their roofs, and believed that was enough. Eli knew. The most dangerous winter begins not when people have prepared nothing, but when they think they have prepared everything. This knowledge came at a high price. 16 years before arriving in River Falls, Eli lived in a mountain village in northern Pennsylvania. His father worked in a mine, and his mother ran a small inn by the road. The houses were close together, but in winter the distance between adjacent porches could become impassable. Snow fell for days, winds blew doors shut, and frost crept through the walls so slowly that people only noticed the danger when the water froze in their pitchers. The winter Elijah turned 19, a storm raged across the mountains for 5 days. On the first day, it seemed like a normal snowfall. On the second, the roads disappeared. On the third, the snowdrifts reached rooftops and chimneys began to clog. Families were trapped in their homes, uncertain whether their neighbors were alive. Elijah's father attempted to reach the miners' barracks, where 12 men were staying, but lost his way 20 steps from the porch. He was only found in the spring after the snow melted. Eli's younger sister died that same night. There was still firewood in their house, but the chimney was blocked, the smoke seeped in, and the stove had to be extinguished. Across the wall was an inn with 2 large fires burning and plenty of food. but there were only 15 paces of open space between the buildings. No one could walk that distance in the blizzard. Eli held his sister in his arms until dawn, feeling her breathing grow weaker and weaker. And beyond the wall he could hear the muffled voices of people who could save her. In the spring, the villagers dug a passage between two houses to carry supplies without venturing into the mud. The work took less than a week. Eli looked at this short tunnel and thought of only one thing. If they had completed it before winter, his father and sister would still be alive. From then on, he stopped thinking of the space between the houses as empty space. For him, it was a threat that had to be eliminated beforehand. In River Falls, the houses were spaced far apart. It was about 40 steps from Eli's to the cabin of widow Ellen Price. Beyond that stood the house of the blacksmith Bale, then the schoolhouse, the church, and Mercer's store. Eli knew it was impossible to connect the entire village with a single passage, so he chose the North Street, where families with small children, the elderly, and people unable to withstand the cold for long lived. Ellen Price was the first to agree. Her husband had drowned during the spring floods, leaving her with 2 children and a house in constant need of repair. Ellen distrusted talk of Eli's madness, having witnessed him repair her roof for free and never mention it. When he asked permission to tunnel to her cellar, she asked only one question. Would the ground beneath the house collapse? Eli showed her the plans, explained the structure of the supports, and promised to stop if he noticed even the slightest movement in the foundation. The passage to Ellen's house was completed in 3 months. Eli dug on his side, while her eldest son carried out the earth in small buckets. The ceiling was reinforced with crossbeams every 2 steps. Eli laid dry straw between the boards and the soil, which absorbed moisture and made it possible to detect leaks. At the bottom of the wall, he dug a narrow trench, through which meltwater flowed into a deep pit filled with stones. At both ends of the tunnel were double doors. The first, wooden, kept out the earth and drafts. The second, lined with felt, served to retain heat. A small space was left between the doors to prevent cold air from immediately entering the house. Oil lamps, protected by metal mesh, hung on the walls, and a rope ran along the passage. Even if smoke extinguished the fire or a person fainted from fear, they could still move by holding on to the rope. Eli didn't limit himself to the passage. In the widened niches, he placed what the residents later assumed were the Madman's supplies. They contained buckets with lids, crackers, sacks of oats, candles, spare mittens, wool blankets, and small stoves. In one niche, he stacked wooden shields. If part of the ceiling began to collapse, they could be used to block the dangerous area and direct people along an alternate route. When the tunnel reached the blacksmith's house, Harold Bale initially refused to let Eli into the cellar. He claimed that a man who dug underground at night couldn't be sane. But his wife, Martha, reminded him that their youngest son often choked in the cold air in the winter. After weeks of arguing, Harold relented, demanding that the passage end behind a thick iron door, the key to which he alone would retain. Eli agreed. It didn't matter to him what people called the tunnel or how many locks they installed on the entrances. All that mattered was that the doors could be opened when needed. By the end of December, 4 buildings were connected underground. The school was less than 20 steps away, but it was then that Headman Crane demanded the work be stopped. He claimed Eli was disturbing the peace and frightening the children. The real reason was different. The tunnel was being constructed without the headman's permission, and residents increasingly turned to the silent hermit for advice, not to him. Crane came to Eli with Mercer and 2 men. They descended into the passage, inspected the beams and niches, after which the elder said the whole thing should be sealed. "You're making people wait for a catastrophe," he said. Eli ran his hand along the damp wall and replied that the catastrophe doesn't go away just because they're forbidden to talk about it. Crane took these words as a challenge. He gave Eli 3 days to stop digging and scheduled Saturday morning to backfill the main entrance. The men left, leaving a trail of dirt behind them. Eli stood in the tunnel for a long time, listening to the barely perceptible creaking of the earth. Then he climbed out and looked north. The sky there was clear. No clouds, no snow, no sign of a storm. But Elijah's old bay mare stood by the wall, her back to the wind, refusing to go into the barn. The water in the well had dropped lower than usual, and a wide white circle had appeared around the moon. There were 2 days left before the tunnel's scheduled backfilling. Eli entered the house, took an old pocket barometer from a locked wooden box, and saw the needle dropping faster than ever before. Then he realized Crane's men might not have time to destroy the passage. The blizzard would arrive first. The blizzard arrived on Friday, the day before the mayor's men were scheduled to fill the tunnel. The morning began unusually quiet. Snow lay evenly on the roofs, smoke from the chimneys rose almost vertically, and the air seemed milder than the day before. The residents of River Falls assumed Eli's warnings would prove empty once again. Doyle Mercer even opened the door of his shop and told the first customers that Mole was probably hiding his barometer so no one would notice his mistake. Meanwhile, Eli was inspecting the underground passage. He checked every beam, filled the lamps with oil, moved 3 more bundles of firewood into the niches, and placed axes by the doors. At Ellen Price's house, he asked the children not to leave after noon. At Bale the blacksmith's, he ordered them to keep the iron door unlocked. Harold frowned, but didn't argue. During the night, his youngest son was breathing heavily again, and the thought of a warm underground passage no longer seemed so absurd to the blacksmith. Eli was the last to reach the school. The tunnel wasn't finished before it reached the school. Between the end of the passage and the school cellar were about 15 paces of hard, frozen earth. Eli worked there almost all night, but managed to dig only a narrow passage, narrow enough for a grown man to move only on his knees. Teacher Mary Hall came down to him with a candle and saw that the shirt on his back was soaked through with sweat despite the cold ground. "Do you think it will happen today?" she asked. Eli stopped hammering his pick and listened. Overhead, he could hear the children's footsteps, the creaking of floorboards, and the hum of the furnace. "Before evening," he replied. Mary looked at the dark hole in front of him. "Will you make it?" Eli lifted his pick. "If the earth allows." By midday, the wind shifted. It came suddenly from the north, hitting the houses with a heavy, cold gust. The smoke above the chimneys curled and drifted along the roofs. The horses in the corrals began to stamp their hooves restlessly, and the dogs whined and hid under their porches. A few minutes later, a grey band appeared on the horizon like low fog. Mayor Crane stood by the window of his house and watched the streak of snow grow taller. He kept telling himself it was just a normal snowfall. Then the wind picked up so much that a board was torn from the roof of a neighbouring barn. It flew across the street and shattered the window of an empty warehouse. Crane stepped back from the glass. At that moment, the grey wave reached the first houses. The snow didn't just start falling. It attacked the village from all sides at once. The wind lifted old snow from the fields, mixed it with the new, and turned the air into an opaque white mass. In a matter of minutes, the fences disappeared. Then the barns vanished. Then the opposite side of the street vanished as if it had never existed. Mercer tried to close the shop's shutters, but a gust of wind ripped one from his hands and nearly pulled him outside. 2 men pulled the owner back in and pressed against the door. Fine snow immediately began to seep through the cracks. It lay on the floor in white streaks, even though the door was closed. There were 18 children in the schoolhouse. When the blizzard hit, Mary Hall ordered them away from the windows. The stove was burning well, with enough wood left until evening, and at first the teacher decided to wait it out. But half an hour later, one of the window frames cracked. Cold air rushed in a thin stream. Then the other frame began to shake. Snow quickly accumulated against the north wall, obscuring the lower half of the windows. Mary remembered Eli's words and descended into the cellar. The tunnel's opening was behind the coal bins. She pulled back the planks and saw a narrow passage ahead. The sound of a pickaxe could be heard from the darkness. Eli was close, but there was still earth between them. "Mr. Voss!" she screamed. The blows stopped. For a few seconds nothing happened, then a muffled voice came from the wall. "Take the children to the cellar. Get blankets and water. Don't open the outside door." Mary went upstairs. The children were no longer singing or talking. They sat by the stove, listening to the wind pounding the walls. The teacher separated the older and younger children, ordered each to take a book, a blanket, or a piece of wood, and began leading them downstairs. No one understood why they were going into the dark cellar, but fear made the children obedient. Meanwhile, at Ellen Price's house, snow had completely obscured the front door. The wind was pushing against it from the outside so hard that the hinges began to creak. The firewood was in the shed, and only a few logs remained in the house. Ellen knew that if the stove went out, the children wouldn't survive the night. She opened the hatch in the floor. Warm air and the dim light of the lamps rose from the tunnel. What the village had laughed at for almost 2 years was now the only open way out of her house. Ellen wrapped the children in blankets, lowered them down, and closed the hatch above her. For the first time since the storm began, the roar of the wind became quieter. Harold Bale was already standing at the blacksmith's iron door. He held his youngest son in his arms and looked down the passage, hesitating to enter. Just a few weeks ago he'd demanded a lock be placed between his home and the tunnel. Now, that lock seemed more terrifying to him than the darkness itself. When Ellen and the children emerged from the depths, Harold opened the door. His wife brought warm clothes and a sack of bread. The families moved toward Eli's house, holding onto a rope along the wall. It was damp and cramped underground, but there was no wind. The lamps burned steadily. The beams did not shake. The children, who had feared the tunnel in the summer, now touched its walls as if they were secure. Soon, others began descending through the passage. One of the men reached the Bale's house down the street, tying himself with a rope. He reported that the roof of the store was damaged, a window was broken in the widow Clark's house, and old Jeremy Frost was alone on the south side. Eli listened to him, handed him some spare clothes, and told everyone not to come upstairs again. "But how do we get to the others?" Harold asked. Eli looked at the branch leading to the school. "Kids first," he said. He crawled back into the narrow passage. The ground ahead was hard as stone. Every blow of the pickaxe reverberated in his shoulders. Clay rained down from the ceiling. The air grew thinner. The lamp burned dimly. Beyond the wall he could hear the voices of children gathered in the school cellar. An hour passed. Then another. The stove at the top of the school began to die down. The cold descended the stairs, and the children huddled closer together. Mary Hall held a candle against the earthen wall and counted the blows. At first they sounded far away, then closer. Finally, the surface before her trembled, and earth poured out of a crack. The tip of a pickaxe appeared. Then a fist-sized hole appeared in the wall. Through it, the light of a lamp, and Eli's voice shone. "Don't be afraid. I'm almost there." The children screamed with joy for the first time in hours. Eli widened the passage until the smallest child could squeeze through. The older ones passed the younger ones forward, and the people on the other side took them and wrapped them in blankets. Mary was the last one to crawl through. As soon as she was in the tunnel, a heavy cracking sound resounded above them. The schoolhouse shook. Part of the roof collapsed under the weight of the snow. The stove toppled over, sending sparks scattering across the floor. If the children had remained upstairs for a few more minutes, the exit from the cellar would have been blocked. Eli closed the breach with a wooden shield and led everyone to his hut. There were now 34 people underground, but the southern half of the village was still cut off. There remained Elder Crane, the people in the store, the Clark family, and Old Man Frost. In Eli's house, Mary noticed a second wooden box, the very one he'd brought to River Falls many years ago. The lid was now open. Inside lay folded maps, a compass, miners' masks, and a long coil of red rope. Eli took the rope and began tying it around his waist. Harold realized what he was about to do and grabbed his arm. "You won't find them in this storm." Eli tightened the knot and looked at the door, where the wind howled. "Not on the street," he replied, "but there's a cellar under the bench, and it's less than 20 paces away." There were less than 20 steps left to the store's cellar, but that night they seemed longer than any road. The wind had already blown the street up to the rooftops, and not a single landmark remained between the houses. Eli returned to the unfinished tunnel, tied the red rope to a support, and crawled forward, breaking up the frozen earth with his pick. Harold Bale followed him. Just that morning, the blacksmith had called this passage a madman's hole, but now he held a lantern and put his shoulder under each new beam. Eli crushed the earth, Harold hauled away the dirt, and the men behind him passed it bucket after bucket. Meanwhile, the women laid the children down near the stoves. A blizzard roared above them. Sometimes the ground shook so violently that clay rained down from the ceiling. One support cracked, but Eli immediately erected a shield. "If you hear another crack, crawl back," he said. Harold asked what Eli himself would do. "I'll try to make sure there isn't a second one." There were 9 men in Mercer's shop. They had boarded up the windows and were stoking the stove with the remains of some crates. But the roof had already caved in, and the snow-clogged chimney was pushing smoke inward. Crane tried to remain calm, but every gust of wind forced him to look at the floor. He knew there was a cellar under the bench, and he knew Eli's tunnel must lie behind the northern wall. A week ago, Crane had ordered the masonry reinforced. Now, the only hope might lie behind that wall. When the first blow came from below, people thought the foundation was collapsing. Mercer descended with a lamp and saw lime crumbling from the masonry. The blow was repeated. A crack appeared between the stones, through which a thin beam of light shone. Crane immediately realized who was on the other side. Just hours ago, he'd been planning to bury Eli's work. Now the man was cutting a path through the earth toward him. The men began dismantling the masonry from the inside. Mercer pried out stones with a crowbar. Crane threw them aside with his bare hands. Soon a hole appeared in the wall, revealing Harold's clay-smeared face. Eli stood behind him. "Everyone down," he said. "Take only water, blankets, and those who can't walk on their own." The men descended into the cellar just as a deafening crash erupted from above. The shop's central beam broke, the roof caved in, and dumped heavy snow onto the floor. The stove overturned. Had they delayed any longer, the cellar would have been cut off. Eli led the people along a new route. The adults had to move on their knees. A red rope along the wall marked the way through the smoke and darkness. When the lamp went out, the people found their way with their hands. Reaching the main corridor, Crane saw what he hadn't wanted to notice before. Firewood and blankets lay in niches, and buckets of water lined the walls. Every beam was adjusted, every turn marked, every entrance protected by double doors. This wasn't a secret lair. Eli was building a refuge for the people who laughed at him. However, south of the shop, Widow Clark and her 3 daughters, along with Old Man Frost, remained. The tunnel didn't reach them. Eli took out his miner's compass, tied the remaining rope around his waist, and prepared to go up. Crane stood in front of the door. "You've done enough," he said. Eli looked at him. Enough for whom? The elder found no answer. This time, Harold and Crane went with him. They held onto a rope secured at the entrance. Snow beat in their faces, their breath froze on their scarves, and the wind tried to knock them off their feet. Eli used a compass to determine their direction. They couldn't see any houses, but they counted their steps. The Clarks' home was less than 100 steps away, but the journey took almost half an hour. The door was buried, and the men climbed in through the window. The woman and the girls sat under the table, wrapped in rugs. The last of the firewood had burned out, and the glass was coated with ice from the inside. On the way back, Crane carried the youngest girl. Twice, the rope kept him from disappearing into the white void. Then they returned for Frost. They found the old man near the extinguished stove. Eli tied him to a wooden door, turning it into a sled, and 3 men dragged him to the tunnel. By morning, there were 52 people underground and in Eli's house. It was cramped and stuffy. Children slept next to sacks of oats. Adults sat along the walls. But no one was freezing. The firewood remained dry, the water didn't freeze, and the layer of earth dampened the wind. The blizzard lasted nearly 2 days. When it died down, snow had buried the houses up to the windows, and the streets were transformed into white hills. The school's roof lay inside the building. The store was half destroyed. The Clarks' house lost its north wall, and Frost's cabin disappeared under a snowdrift. The tunnel held up. 3 days later, the villagers gathered in the church. Crane stood before them and struggled to begin. His hands were cut from the stones he'd pulled out of the cellar wall. Finally, he admitted that he'd ordered the passage filled in not because it was dangerous. He was afraid of losing his power and didn't want to admit that the silent hermit understood winter better than he did. "I wanted to destroy the road that saved my life," he said. "If the blizzard had come a day later, we ourselves would have buried the only safe place in the village." In the spring, the residents continued their work together. The tunnel connected the school, the church, the store, and 9 other houses. A lamp and a coil of red rope were hung over each entrance. The men checked the beams, the women replenished supplies, and the children learned to navigate underground without light. Eli was no longer called Mole, at least not derisively. When thanked, he replied that the tunnel itself hadn't saved anyone. It was the work done before they believed it was necessary that saved them. Many years passed. Houses were rebuilt, streets were widened, and old entrances were gradually closed. But part of the tunnel remained beneath the former school. Pickaxe marks and a faded piece of red rope remained visible on one beam for a long time. The people of River Falls used to pass on a saying to children: "When the sky is clear, prepare the way for the storm." Snow can hide streets, wind can erase footprints, and people can laugh at what they don't understand. But a road built in advance remains a road, even when the rest of the world disappears.